Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare executives about their lives and careers. If you like this episode, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. My guest today is David Coman, CEO of Science37. The company is a publicly traded pioneer in decentralized clinical trials, and it offers an end-to-end operating system for fully decentralized trials and hybrid trials that include traditional site-based approaches and virtual components. I first met David about 5 years ago when he was Chief Strategy Officer and Head of Trial Oversight at ERT. David, I've seen you a few times since then, but first time on the podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Good to see you.
So I want to hear a lot about Science37, but first I want to hear about sort of how you got there, starting way back at the beginning, if you don't mind, and just curious about like what your upbringing was like, if you had any childhood influences that have stuck with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm a Midwestern boy. Parents were, my mother was a guidance counselor. My father was in fundraising for not-for-profit companies, and pretty carefree childhood, I think. And both parents, I think, were very driven in terms of work ethic. So work hard, um, execute, good things will happen. Both of them went to Michigan State for college, and then I followed suit. So when it came time for me to look for a college, it was sort of like a fait accompli.
Yeah.
And I went to Michigan State and had a great time. So that's sort of like the Dave Coman in the early days.
That sounds
Uh,
good. There's some guests that I've had that had like a really, hardships growing up, tough immigrant stories and all that. And you can see, all right, if you survive that, obviously you're going to rise and be a CEO. But it sounds like you had the hardworking parents, but you had like an easy, relatively easy, straightforward, loving childhood. It sounds like, and you still managed to achieve.
that's right. That's right. It's funny. There is, I think, a trigger that happens at some point in your career. For me, it was actually during my college years, probably, where I looked around. Going to a big school like Michigan State, you think, okay, well, what's my competition look like? There's about 46,000 kids going to school at Michigan State.
Yeah.
I was an advertising major because I didn't really know what to do. It sounded fun. I like commercials. And at some point, I looked around and said, okay, now it's getting real. You actually have to make a career out of what you're studying here. And so, a trigger switched, I think, at one point for me when I was in school to try to figure out how to separate myself from the rest of the pack that were around me. So one of the things, I mean, I did a few internships, which was, I think, great. But the other thing I did is I actually wrote a book while I was on campus. It was an evaluation of all the professors called the Professor's Report Card.
Yeah.
And, I took that and I rated all the professors based off of data that I collected from the other students. They would feed me data. I would put that into the book, put a little bit of color on top of it, sold some advertising space, marketed it, and sold it through the bookstore. And that's, of course, what I paid for my beer money while I was going to school. But it was less about the beer money, of course, that helped, and more about what are you going to do to separate yourself? How are you actually going to distinguish yourself? And I graduated in 1991 in the middle of a recession,
Yeah.
and I was an advertising major from Michigan State. And so, that was the big question. How do you actually make it? And as an ad guy back in those days.
Yeah.
And that's really helped distinguish myself.
So you did go through a few things. I think you started on a kind of an ad agency area, and then I saw some work at telecoms before you sort of moved over into the healthcare field. How did that all transpire?
Sure. I graduated and I wanted to go on Madison Avenue, so moved to New York with my girlfriend, now my wife,
Yeah.
of 26 years. And
Nice.
we, had just hit the streets. Every day I was looking for job. I would interview people. I'd ask them if I could meet a few other people that they knew and just continue to market myself. Uh, Landed a job at Young and Rubicam, which is the largest ad agency in the world at the time, and worked my tail off. I would say I would work till 1 o'clock in the morning regularly. This kind of goes back to that upbringing, like two nights a week, I would assume, um, in just around the clock. And ultimately, it paid off. I mean, I was the youngest account executive, I think, in the company's history back in the day, and then continued to progress through the advertising field. Ultimately, working on everything from AT&T to Xerox, and then I landed into the telecom space for quite a few years. Ultimately, decided that I wanted to do something that was a little bit more fulfilling, besides selling another cigarette lighter adapter for a mobile phone. I ended up finding an opportunity at a company called Dendrite, which was a software company that enabled pharma sales forces to automate and data behind it in order to help trigger activity. And so that was a fundamental switch for me, going from X outside of industry and bringing it into industry, which I think was really important to have that outside industry perspective to bring it in house. It certainly helped in the early days at Dendrite.
Well, that sounds good, Dave. I'm in a new location and my camera decided to poop out for a minute there. So it was, I would like to say, the advertising was so strong that it just flushed out the camera, but I think it's because I didn't plug it in right. So that sounds like a very logical, very logical kind of place. Now, by the time I ran into you over at ERT, what was going on over there? What were you trying to do there? What was the whole game of that company?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an important step in between, which was 7 years that I had at Quintiles, where I ran communications and marketing. I also developed something called the digital patient unit, which was, I decided that in the clinical trial space, you have to really start as a marketer on who the customer is. And I always thought that the industry had the customer wrong, which is the site. And I thought the customer really should be the patient. And so I developed something called the digital patient unit back in the day, which was really designed to find, engage patients for clinical research, observational studies, and disease management programs. And I think that we grew a nice business over there before, realizing that that's fitting something like that inside a traditional CRO, at least back in those days, was a difficult fit. So anyway, ended up over at ERT afterwards to run strategy. And so the role over at ERT was really about finding companies that were similar in nature. So we defined ourselves as a data collection company, and so we went out and found companies that were similar and ended up purchasing them at an EBITDA arbitrage and rolling those things up, and was hugely successful in terms of generating enterprise value on behalf of our PE shareholders.
Oh, that's terrific. So, Dave, then I first heard about Science37 around the time that you were over at ERT, and then you made the move over there. And it's a company that people have heard of since because you've made a big splash in the whole field of decentralized trials has become big. But it's a company that's been around for a little while. It wasn't one that just sort of sprang up in 2020 or 21. Can you say a little bit about kind of the history of the company and how you heard about it, how you got interested in it?
Yeah, the company was formed back in 2014 by a couple of dermatologists who were actively engaging in clinical research and decided that instead of having to have the patients travel into their clinic, they could actually go to the patients through a video screen, or even have a mobile nurse go out to their home in order to be able to check, how things were going. And then built on top of that a technology platform in order to enable all those activities to take place in one system. And so the founder was quite a visionary, I think, back in the day, to be able to pull all that together into one place, and took an idea and built a business. And as I sat back in my old Quintiles day building the digital patient unit, I sort of looked at this company from afar and said, gosh, they're really doing that in isolation outside of a traditional wall of CRO, which really enabled them to kind of flourish. Now, I came into Science37 at the end of 2019. I think the company went through an evolution where it did a lot of trial and error, and sometimes it did some error. And
Yeah.
so, I look at some of the new players that are coming into the space. I get concerned about them sometimes. It's not easy to conduct fully decentralized clinical trials. You actually have to think through all the detail from, where do you identify the patients? How do you identify them? Are they self-identifiable or not? What kind of channels do you want to use? And ultimately to bring them in-house. That's just the recruitment part. But then after the recruitment, it's about getting them to consent, and then it's engaging them and fulfilling the protocol properly with the right sorts of controls and measurement in order to ensure that you're actually delivering on that and producing super high quality data. And so all of that is kind of core to the Science37 model, executing all of those capabilities from the very beginning of the trial to fruition, with the patient mostly participating from the comfort of their own home.
So, it's a new industry still, even though Science37 has been around for a while. And one of the things I think is just sort of wrestling with how to describe it. And you hear decentralized trials, also sometimes the term virtual trials or digital trials. I've seen you've been using the word agile trials. There's hybrid, which I guess is easy to understand once you understand the other pieces. How do you think about these sort of terminology and how it relates to what's going on in the industry?
Yeah, the industry term is decentralized clinical trials, and it's meant to mean doing things outside of the traditional clinical trial site. I think that it's a misnomer, frankly. If you think about a traditional clinical trial where you are setting up a network of sites, each of them with their own people, processes, and technology, and then you're pulling those together, those data together that's being collected from each of the individual sites, and having a monitor fly around the world to make sure that each of those sites are actually, following the protocol and being compliant. To me, that feels very decentralized.
Yeah.
And so, the Science37 model is all about creating, through one unifying technology platform that generates all the evidence, harmonizes that data, creates all the workflow, setting standardized SOPs against what we call our networks. That includes patient communities, our telemedicine investigators, community providers that refer patients into the clinical trials. Sometimes we'll do procedures, mobile nurses, remote coordinators, and devices that all plug into it. Everything is operationalized in a very centralized method.
Yeah.
If you actually go to the technology and the workflow that sits within the technology, every patient has their own unique journey that they take, and the technology platform follows them through that journey, whether it is, and ultimately it comes down to visits, right? So the investigator, the nurse, the coordinator knows exactly where each of those individual patients are on their own unique journey to create a more systematic way of managing each of them, which I believe ultimately not only centralizes the capabilities, but also creates better compliance, and ultimately should produce higher quality data.
Well, I'm glad to hear it right from the horse's mouth. I made 7 healthcare predictions for 2022, and one was that clinical trials simultaneously decentralize and centralize, because it seems that there's a lot of centralized elements of a decentralized trial, the way you've described it. So, thanks for laying that out.
Yeah, no problem.
If you think about your offerings, I noticed you use the term Metasite, and then recently there was some description I heard about Metasite Lite and Metasite Rescue. What is a Metasite, and what role does that play in your overall offerings?
Well, if you take what we do and translate that into a traditional site network, so pharma company will set up a series of sites around the world, and patient recruitment enrollment is always a problem. So what we're set up to do in these cases is to act as another site or a virtual site that sits alongside of a traditional site network. We call that a metasite, virtual site, metasite, and ultimately become a vehicle to attract patients no matter where they are, rather than being trapped to the geography around the sites that actually exist in the clinical trial.
And so, what does it mean to be like, light or rescue?
Oh
How do
yeah,
those come in?
yeah. So when we talk about the Metasite Lite, really what we're talking about is this, skinny down version of a traditional Metasite. So just to give you some, context, we recently completed an infectious disease trial where we were recruiting 70 patients per month, where the average clinical trial site was recruiting zero point 0.9.
Yeah.
And so our ability to create throughput, bring more patients in is immense. Now, the Metasite Lite solution is designed really to look at displacing, let's call it the bottom 10% of a traditional site network.
Mm-hmm.
So if you set up a site network, traditionally about 10, 11% of sites that are set up recruit zero patients.
Yeah.
And so if you just take away that 10%, it sits in the bottom, and you add Science37 as Metasite Lite, it's exactly what we mean. It's very, just get a few patients and utilize Science37 as a risk mitigation
Mm-hmm.
solution for your clinical trial. And it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense, particularly for the CRO industry who's setting up a network of sites. Ultimately, what we do is we de-risk. Now,
Got it.
that's a prospective solution. A retrospective solution is actually when the trial starts to slow down and you set up a network of sites around the world and each of them are underperforming. Ultimately, what we're brought in to do is then rescue. And so this is when we play catch up mode. We can initiate the study in a 4 week period, get up and running, and have data collection happening, recruitment happening immediately. And so this is a quick response to a problem that we see up to 80% of the time within the industry. So, most for the folks who aren't from the industry, most 80% of trials are delayed. The most common reason for those delays is because of patient recruitment. And so Metasite Rescue enables us to get those studies back on track.
Makes sense. So, Dave, you went through quickly a few types of networks that you have. Nursing network. It sounds like you have some relationship, with investigators and so on. Can you just lay out sort of what networks do you have? Do you have, in fact, your own site network, traditional site network, as well as other kinds of networks? It's just that's never been completely clear to me.
Well, we have a network of, I'll go through each of them, patient communities. And so we have a community of our own, about 600,000 patients. We also have relationships with pharmacies and labs and associations from which we might pull patients into clinical trials. Another network we have are community providers. Those community providers aren't necessarily sites. What they typically do is they're a referral agent, and they'll have patients in their practice who are eligible for a clinical trial, and they want to provide that patient with clinical research as a care option, and they'll refer patients into Science37. Now, sometimes those providers also will do procedures for us, for the sponsor for the trial, in order to be able to accommodate specific protocol design needs that may require something to be done in a clinic setting. We have a community or a network of telemedicine investigators. Those are either on staff or part-time that we can leverage to be able to oversee the study, to manage visits, etc. Mobile nurses, most of our mobile nurses are, actually all of our nurses in the United States are Science37 employees. Outside of the United States, it's sort of a mix. We're really proud of our nurse network because all of them are following the exact same SOPs, no matter what the protocol is, where they live, they're still following Science37 SOPs, and then on top of that, whatever the protocol design is. It's not like we have a nurse agency that goes off and finds local agencies, and
Yeah.
each of those individuals are on their own, on their own SOPs, which we try to create a lot more continuity this way. The last grouping is what we call CRCs, or clinical research coordinators, and it is what they sound like. So this is managing the patient flow from the initiation all the way to the completion of the visit. And these guys form a nice relationship with those patients to ensure that they're following the protocol. The patient knows what to expect next in the clinical trial, and we create a unifying experience across each of them. Remember, again, going back to that juxtaposition I provided earlier, each study has one set of CRCs, one set of coordinators, nurses, investigators that they're dealing with the entire time, versus having a whole bunch of disjointed sites around the world executing that for each individual patient.
Got it. Now, that sounds like a very coherent approach. You also mentioned that you work with CROs and help them, with some of their traditional site networks and all that. I'm wondering whether, all those sort of service offerings and networks that you just mentioned, how do they play in, when you're competing with some of these, tech-only partners? On the one hand, on tech-only, like providers, there's some companies that are just providing kind of the tech side. I know you've been emphasizing the tech side of things. How do you fit into that, and are you evolving in how you go from the sort of the broader comprehensive service offerings to the tech only approach?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the way we see ourselves is an operating system in order to enable decentralization. And you used the term earlier
Yeah.
that I know you've seen from some of our marketing, which was we call them more agile clinical trials. So we're enabling that flexibility to take the site, or the patient from the site 100% of the time, and we can enable the patient to actually be seen from the site or at home, or delivered at a point of care center nearby. So creating that flexibility is super important. Our way where we're structured is the technology itself can be licensed, and so a CRO can license that technology from us. It's even a SaaS-based license, so if they want to actually execute it themselves, they can utilize the technology and for their trials, ultimately giving them the ability to execute this. And then they might pull in our telemedicine investigators or our mobile nurses to expand the utility of our offering to ensure that they can deliver on the trial the way that it needs to be delivered.
Now, one of the things that the decentralized trials have been touted for is increasing of diversity and inclusion. That's a major issue. It also seems to be that DCTs are a good solution. I know you've really been kind of stepping to the fore there. Can you talk about how you see the intersection of decentralized trials with diversity and inclusion of patients?
Yeah, I mean, diversity and inclusion is a big deal. It's a big issue actually within clinical research. Over the last several years, if you roll up all the patients that have been enrolled, 86% of them are Caucasian, and so we're leaving out you know diverse ethnic mix on almost every single study. If you take a look at a cross section of all the patients that Science37 has recruited across all of its studies, it actually looks like the total population. And so if you're not encumbered by a geographic location, which typically happens to be in more affluent, more Caucasian neighborhoods today, it gives you the ability to go reach into other communities and pull them into clinical research. Now, it's super important regardless from a social standpoint and from a scientific standpoint. And as we move into the future, FDA is driving us into that direction as well to ensure that if you are commercializing a drug, that the same populations are actually taking that drug in the clinical setting. Now, beyond just the ethnic sort of diversity, I also think we need to take a little step back at clinical research in general. And if the model is working the way it's supposed to work, you and I or anybody should be able to participate in a clinical trial. But the reality is, it doesn't just exclude ethnic communities; it excludes people in general, only 8%, eight, that's, 0.8 percent of the population are ever approached about joining a clinical trial today. So at least 92% of the rest of the population that aren't even getting a chance to participate. Now, I've said this before, I think it's really important. If you know that there's a solution out there to enable anybody to participate, which is essentially what we're able to do at clinical research, don't you have an ethical obligation to enable that level of participation? I think the answer is yes.
Well, Dave, I think also, it does go back to your point to say that, 80% of trials, that's 80, have problems with enrollment, essentially. They get delayed. And if only 8% of the population is being approached, I mean, I think that points you toward the solution right there.
Yeah, right on.
So, you said you joined Science37 in 2019. So I guess sort of like Coman 19 coming over there just before the pandemic. What has been the impact of the pandemic on the industry and on Science37?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was definitely a COVID boost for the business back in the day. And if you think about a world where most of the sites were shut down for a period of time, the Science 37 technology enabled patients and providers, sites to be able to stay in touch without actually having to go to a physical location. Now, that was the impetus, I think, for broader acceptance. But then a interesting thing happened, which is that I think the industry found that you're actually recruiting patients faster. You're creating more diversity. You're creating a level of quality that you maybe didn't expect. And so ultimately, sites have all been open since the beginning of 2021. And yet the move to decentralization has continued to accelerate. Well, why is that? It's all about the delivery. So the more we can continue to prove that the model makes sense, recruiting faster, getting the right kind of patients, retaining patients longer, and reducing the patient burden, I think the more you're going to see this model continue to flourish.
So, what is your expectation as we move, hopefully, beyond the pandemic and into the next, 3 to 5 years? Where are you heading? Where is the industry heading?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the data points to the same thing, which is that we're going to continue to see more decentralization, but we're also going to see more of the confluence between the two. So maybe sites initiating the patients and then patients working from the comfort of their own home. Some studies where you'll have independent sites and then you're going to have Science 37 as a Metasite standing beside them. And different permutations of the model to enable a level of flexibility that wasn't considered in the past design models for clinical trials. And I think that you're going to continue to see this more agile clinical trial development proliferate over the coming years. And then there won't be a discussion around decentralizing or traditional. It'll be executing clinical trials. And all clinical trials will be agile, and we'll be in a world where we're trying to unburden the patient as much as possible, enable any patient to participate anywhere in clinical trials, and enable procedures to happen where they need to happen. So I think that is going to continue on into the future as we progress and do the right thing and experience the results.
It sounds good, Dave. Well, so in all of your time there running a public company, any chance to read any books? And is there anything you would recommend or anything you recommend we avoid?
Well, so on things to consume, things to read, tell you one of my favorite books is From Impressed to Obsessed. It's a book about customer satisfaction, and it's fundamental idea here. It's not good enough just to have customer success. They have to be obsessed with the work that you're
Yeah.
doing. And I like that book so much. Actually, we took it and dissected it and created training across the whole organization on how to create an environment where you're really obsessed around ensuring that our customers are getting the best possible experience. And so that's one of my favorite books. And this is last year I read that one. A new one that just read recently is leading with gratitude. And so this is what it sounds like. It's actually dissecting the way people internalize the information that's fed to them. And if you create a culture of gratitude, that it's self-fulfilling, and happier your employees are, happier teams are, the more it feeds upon itself, and the more productivity actually you get out of your organization. And so I believe in this full force. In fact, actually, even before I read this book, one of the 4 values in our organization. So, we create, like typical companies, we have specific values that we cherish. One of ours is gratitude, and so permeating that throughout the organization, I think, is really important in order to create a culture that is supportive, but also super productive.
Great. Well, David Coman, CEO of Science37, thank you for joining me today on the HealthBiz podcast to talk about decentralized clinical trials.
Have me, David.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.